Hey guys, iKailaKai here, and it's been a little while. Aside from all of the personal things that I've been going through in my life, what I have been doing for the last 2 weeks that I've been absent from YouTube is playing a lot of OP13. I can't claim to say that I've played more than anyone else, but I have played over 150 games in what has been about a week and a half as of the time of recording this video. As such, as we've had a couple of championships in Japan and my own testing, I would like to go over what I believe to be the OP13 meta, but from the outside, OP13 just seems to be Red Blue Ace and Black Ema. But is it really that way? I believe that OP13 is one of the most interesting metas for a specific type of player. So in this video, I'd like to illustrate exactly what kind of meta I believe OP13 is, what decks are doing well in OP13, and of course, what other decks I think could potentially see a little bit more play and do well in the future with the right testing, list, or player. This video is relatively short, but if you're playing in the Eastern meta or you're getting ready to play OP13 ahead of time, then I have an article out on Metafy now, which I've linked in the description below, which you can check out, which has all of my thoughts within this video and more on every single one of the leaders that's listed here. I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to like, subscribe if you haven't already. It always helps me out. I greatly appreciate it as always. Let's get back into this YouTube thing. How many of you guys just skipped the intro? Be honest. I know it was long. It's okay. That's fine. Here's the tier list one more time. Let's talk about the meta through this tier list. I personally think that we are in a triangle meta, but I do think that 2 out of the 3 decks in this triangle meta stand out greatly. Therefore, let's first talk about these 3 decks in order, what makes them strong and what makes them good into each other, and then we'll talk about some of the other peripheral decks and how they deal with this meta that we're in. For those who don't know, triangle meta is essentially just deck A beats deck B beats deck C, and deck C beats deck A, creating a triangle where it's difficult to find a one single best deck because there's no perfect answer to the meta. For OP13, those 3 decks would be Red Blue Ace, a deck that has strong resource generation, good early game and late game power. Black Ema, a deck with relatively weak early game, but the strongest late game the game has ever seen, and Green Zoro, a deck that hits your face harder than it did in OP12, finishing the game as soon as possible. This creates a triangle of Red Blue Ace beating Ema beating Green Zoro, and Green Zoro beating Red Blue Ace. However, I don't think that this meta is actually as simple as it seems because a lot of it comes down to deck building and playing, which makes it so that you're heavily rewarded if you're a very good player in this meta. Let's illustrate a little bit about what I mean with the very first and one of the most anticipated leaders in this entire set, Ema. First, for those who are not fully caught up with OP13, this is what the leader does. It's a mono black leader with 5,000 power and only 4 life. And under the rules, you cannot include events with a cost of 2 or more in your deck. Also, at the start of your game, you play 1 Marijoa type stage from your deck. Then activate main. Once per turn, you may trash 1 Celestial Dragon type character from your field or 1 card from your hand. Then draw 1 card. This leader is so unique that many people's first impressions was that this leader was likely going to be bad. A 4-life monocolor leader with 5,000 power in this day and age does not seem like it can really cut it. Yes, we've had decks like Yellow Enel in the past that have been able to survive this demerit, but Yellow Enel doesn't really have 4 life because his leader effect gives him more life. Ema is purely a 4-life monocolor leader, and 4-life dual color leaders already struggle within this meta. So how can Ema do it with not only this restriction, but not being able to play events that cost 2 or more in the deck? Well, the answer is because of the second line, the Marijoa stage that you can put out. Now, there are 2 Marijoa stages that you can put out as Ema, but let's go over the new one, the Empty Throne, because that is going to be core to the main strategy of Ema when fighting basically everything that's not the mirror. The Empty Throne has 2 effects. On your turn, if you have 19 or more cards in your trash, your leader gains plus 1,000 power. This, I think, is just flavor due to the fact that there are 19 swords around the throne, which if you didn't notice, now you do. However, the activate main effect of this stage is what truly makes this deck go around and make it completely absurd. You may rest this stage and 3 of your dong to play a black 5 elders type character that costs equal or less than the total number of dong that you have on your field. What this means is that when you have 4 dong on your field, all of your 4 cost 5 elders become 3 cost. This also means that if you have 6 dong on your field, you can play out the 6 cost Nasujiro or Mars for only 3 dong. And of course, the 7 cost Jupiter for 3 dong once you get to that point as well. All these cards have rather simple effects. Mercury is just a blocker which on KO draws a card. Saturn is just a searcher. Mars is a blocker but can also KO a base 5 cost or less. Nasujiro is a rush character that can also reduce the power of the opponent's characters, and Jupiter sets the power of all the 5 elders on your board to 7,000. These effects, while strong, are not really worth their actual cost, but become absurd when you think of them as 3 cost cards. However, the absolutely and truly insane thing about this deck is the 4 dong, 27 dong play. We've had things in the past like 8 cost Moria in Black Luffy being able to play out 2 5 costs. But have we ever had a 10 cost card that comes out for only 4 dong and can play 27 dong worth of value immediately onto the board? Essentially, Imo is a ticking time bomb, where this 10 cost 5 Elders, or Gorose as we call it in Japanese, is so powerful that many decks physically cannot beat you when the first one comes out. This single card alone against aggro decks can flip the board from a massively losing state to a completely unwinnable state for the opponent. Even if some decks can survive the first one, it's very rare for decks to be able to survive the second one. And as such, due to this 10 cost Gorose that can come out for only 4 dong, this deck has been a complete menace in the meta. Or so you would think. Because although Imo is absurdly powerful, he's not the only one that's insanely powerful in this meta. Though Imo has immense flexibility in their turns every single turn, being able to play out completely different 5 Elders and adapting their play based on their opponent, giving it the highest flexibility and one of the highest difficulties of a deck that the game has ever seen, sometimes pure and simple moves are the strongest. And that brings us to Red Blue Ace. Ace is a relatively simple deck to play, and although in my article I talk about the version of deck that I prefer, this is a rather standard version of Ace. Ace is a red and blue leader with 6,000 power and 3 life. On your opponent's turn, once per turn, you may trash 1 card from your hand and give up to one of your opponent's characters or leader minus 2,000 power for the battle. Then, with 1 dong attached to your leader, once per turn, if you receive damage or one of your characters with a base power of 6,000 or higher is KO'd, you may draw 1 card. Essentially, this leader covers for most of the weaknesses of not only 3 life 6,000 power leaders in not having very many resources, but also covers a lot of the weaknesses that leaders in general have in having way too many bricks in your hand. Red Blue Ace will rarely brick, and instead will always have a 2,000 counter in hand. On top of this, despite being a 3 life leader, he has the equivalent of at least 4.5 life due to the fact that you're almost always drawing a card every time that you take one of your life, and you may even get some more resources through your characters being KO'd throughout the game. As such, this leader, despite having 6,000 power and despite only having 3 life, will feel like you're hitting into a massive brick wall. Ace generally prefers to go second and go on curve by playing the 4 cost Marco on 4, 6 cost Yamato on 6, and then the 8 cost I Am Whitebeard event to play one of the numerous 9 or 10 cost Whitebeards that are now afforded to us. Now, all of these targets are rather good, but the star is obviously going to be the new card. The OP13 10 cost Whitebeard is a 10 cost 12,000 blocker, which with the event can come out for only 8 dong. Then on play, you can draw 2 cards and trash 1 from your hand and attach 2 dong to your leader as well as one of your characters. Originally, I didn't really rate this card too high within the deck and this whole thematic of playing around the 8 cost event because we weren't really thinking about the scope of Imo. The leader effect being so flexible allows you to play so many different types of cards, and this is further incentivized by the 1 cost Scarp. The 1 cost Scarp is one of the most absurd cards that's been printed in this set, as if your leader is Ace, Sabo, or Luffy, you can search any 3 cost card or higher. Remember that time when we were talking about how that event card was going to be great? Sorry about that, first of all. But this card is actually great. This card, alongside Ace's leader effect, makes the deck so flexible in the ways that it can be built, and therefore, although Ace's moves are rather simple as a whole, it has the tools to deal with a lot of different metas. As Imo and the Mirror are very popular right now, this 8 cost event into the 10 cost Newgate is the most popular way to play the deck, but there is a very aggressive version out there that could be very good in certain other metas. While 6 cost Yamato is the strongest against Imo, 6 cost Ace is really good against Green Zoro. Then conversely, 6 cost Jozu is very good in the Mirror. Figuring out which one of these cards you play not only in the 6 cost slot, but also in the 4 or 5 cost slot makes the deck very tricky to build, and therefore good deck builders are awarded for this deck. The general game plan when playing this deck is to just play on curve as best as you can, and finish out the game with the 10 cost Roger, which, by the way, is searchable, which is, what the this 10 cost Roger is the bane of OP13 right now because there's so many powerful blockers, and this card, while being searchable in this deck, having 13,000 power and rush makes it so it's very difficult for many decks to deal with this deck, as it's very tricky to put Ace into lethal range without getting him down to 0 life thanks to all the 12,000 power blockers that he has in his deck. As such, because Ace can play very well on curve and also has an exceptional late game and a great finisher, this deck is all around an exceptional pick. Currently, at the start of OP13, I believe that Ace is by far the strongest deck, but I can see this changing. If you're enjoying this video, make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Really appreciate all the people who have supported me up until now, and if you would like to join that journey with me, I guess 100,000 is the goal. Next, let's move on to everyone's favorite deck, Green Zoro. Smash the like button and comment your favorite Zoro moment. Let me know what you love the most. I personally love when he does Tashigi into 8,000, 8,000. Zoro's a deck that, by all accounts, hasn't really changed too much in the way that it wants to play, but has become much better at the thing that it was doing before. Zoro as a deck innately doesn't have very much survivability. As such, generally the deck doesn't really want to run that many cards without counter, as there are a lot of times where you're just going to lose with an abundance of cards in your hand. Zoro's a deck that excels at being extremely aggressive and ending the game on his own terms, and OP13 has made that plan so much more powerful by people taking out the 8-cost Mihawk. A card that many people have considered to be one of the strongest in Green Zoro is no longer run in favor of 2 new cards. First, the 4-cost Zoro. Now this 4-cost Zoro on play restands 2 Dong and at the end of your turn becomes active. This isn't a very significant card for the deck, but because it's a 4-cost, it fills up a kind of weak turn that Zoro had when going second. Secondly, the 6-cost Law. Now this 6-cost Law is very good because in a way it's almost more copies of Tashige, and if you already have Tashige, it's just a way to expand your board much easier and much faster. This card being able to bounce back one of your 1-cost Piranhas to your hand, for example, to play out another 5-cost Tashige onto the board, makes your board so much stronger and makes you so much faster at closing out the game. This, alongside having events like Luffy's The Man Will Become King of the Pirates, makes this deck just so much faster and so much stronger than it was before. Green Zoro, at least in Japan in OP12, where we still had 9 Mom, was a rather losing matchup due to the fact that Blue Purple Luffy, although he had 3 life, he didn't really have 3 life. However, Ace actually does have 3 life, and therefore Green Zoro has a very, very good matchup into Ace. By simply just hitting him over and over again, it doesn't really matter how many blockers they play out because you can always rest these with things like Kuina and with things like Tashigi, and through your leader effect and through the 3-cost event, this leader will eventually break through any deck's defenses. At the start of this video, I said that it was a triangle meta, where Ace beats Ime, Ime beats Zoro, and Zoro beats Ace. However, I kind of lied to you. Maybe if you read my meta breakdown on Metafy, link in description, then you would have noticed that I never once mentioned triangle meta. And that's because I think that it's only a triangle meta for the vast majority of players. For the majority of players who don't put in a million games into perfecting every single line. Because I think that we are in an extremely high skill meta. Although Red Blue Ace and Green Zoro can have very simple lines, playing these decks and of course Ime to their limits is extremely difficult. I think that an average ace beats an average Ime. I think that a bad ace beats a good Ime. But I think a great Ime beats a great ace. So therefore, I don't actually think that this meta is a triangle. I think that for people who are extremely dedicated, Ime is the best deck. Ime is a deck that has extremely high flexibility and power, but also doesn't suffer from having low consistency. It's a deck that simply has basically everything that it needs, and it only is down to the player to know exactly what line is going to win the game and know exactly how to play out of unusual situations and of course the mirror. The Ime mirror is one of the most tricky mirrors that I've ever seen because it's so difficult to know exactly where you messed up without just playing out multiple different lines and comparing the results. There's so many uncertainties in this current meta because matchups, even if they are winning, may only feel 55% or 60% winning, meaning that a single card or a single new line found can instantly flip the matchup. And although these 3 decks feel like they're one step ahead of a lot of the other decks in terms of power, that isn't to say that other decks aren't viable within this meta. I think that to be viable in this meta, you just need to beat 2 out of 3 of these decks, because essentially the top 3 can only really beat 2 out of the top 3 as well. Therefore, these are a couple of my picks for decks that I think could have a very good time in OP13 if you decide to dedicate the time to mastering it or, just want to have some fun. Roger is currently in a situation where he can potentially contend with these top 3 decks and beat a lot of them if he can manage to draw his curve. Roger's very similar to a deck like Red Shanks. You try to play on curve best as you can, and when you reach 10 Dong, you play your 10 costs. However, where Shanks can miss some of his early turns and still recover if he can find his top end and not brick before then, Roger tends to struggle here. Roger has a very interesting leader effect. He's the one and only 7,000 power leader in the game, but that comes with a caveat. If you have any Dong on your field, give 1 Dong card that would be added through your Dong phase to your leader. Then, if you have 9 or less Dong cards on your field, give this leader minus 2,000 power. This second line is the big part of Roger. If he isn't at 10 Dong on his board, he will be a 5,000 power leader. But being a 5,000 power leader with 5 life and also having 2 different colors at his disposal is still quite nice. However, the drawback to this luxury is that he cannot play on curve. The first turn when you don't have any Dong cards on your field, you gain your Dong as normal. But every single turn after that, you are forced to attach a Dong to your leader if you gain Dong during your Dong phase. This means that if you start your turn with 10 Dong, you do not need to, and then you're finally unlocked. This creates a scenario where Roger as a deck really wants to ramp early game and has very specific leader locked ramp cards that he's allowed to use to help facilitate that. However, if he misses out on some of these ramp cards, then he can tend to struggle greatly. Still, Roger's a deck that can do very well if he can manage to find his parts going both first and second, making him very potent in this meta. Due to almost every single Roger Pirate card having a ramp attached to it, playing your normal curve will end up accidentally ramping you in a way. Things like the 8-cost Rayleigh that have absurd effects also ramp you at the end of your turn, making it easier for you to not only use your counter events, but also make sure that you get to 10 dong on the opponent's turn. These sorts of cards like the 8-cost Rayleigh and the 8-cost Katakuri are great for this sort of situation, as it forces the opponent to have to deal with your leader being 7,000 before they can really get their foot in the door. Once you get to 10 dong and your leader is 7,000 power, if you can keep playing things like the 10-cost Shanks, you can keep creating situations where it gets harder and harder for the opponent to close out the game due to the fact that your leader is, of course, 7,000 power, while their entire board is minus 1,000. If you can manage to play on curve every single game and play out 10-cost Shanks, I think that Roger would in fact be the best deck in the game. However, the massive issue with this leader, of course, is that you are forced to have 4 cards on curve to be able to pull this off. Therefore, a Roger that can find his parts can feel extremely oppressive and as if there's nothing you can do about it due to the fact that he has 5 life and is 7,000 power so early in the game. But if he doesn't find that, then you kind of wonder, how did this leader become an OP13 leader when there's things like Emu and Ace running around? As such, I think that Roger is a very volatile pick that is very strong, but maybe not the pick if you're trying to win 13 rounds in a row in a regional, for example. While the biggest weakness for Roger is that although all of his searcher cards are of course searchable by the 1-cost Shanks, the top end is not. However, there is everyone's favorite type of card, the promo card, that everyone always gets at a timely manner and is reasonably priced, that has come out for Roger. This promo card, the 8-cost 10,000 Goldie Roger card, if you or your opponent are at 10 dong, then your leader gains plus 2,000 power until the end of the next turn. Now, this card, essentially, when you're at 10 dong, makes your leader 9,000 power. And if you can manage to play multiple of these in a row, then even if you don't have the 10-cost Shanks, you can stay at 9,000 power quite consistently, making it so that this card may be the key to fixing some of Roger's stability issues that he has within the game, as this card is searchable and is another high-value card alongside things like the 10-cost Shanks that people have been replacing with things like 9-cost Newgate, which is objectively worse now. Perhaps this promo card can help Roger, but as it has just come out in Japan, it's hard to tell exactly how much of an effect it will have. That'll be something to look forward to for the next episode to see exactly how much of an influence this promo card will end up having. These 4 leaders are very popular in meta regardless of their power level, but one that I think is underrepresented for how powerful it is Red Black Sabo. Red Black Sabo is a 5,000 power leader with 5 life like Roger, but has a different downside. Like Red Purple Kid way back when in ST10, if you have 4 or more life cards, you have minus 1,000 power to your leader. This means that once you get to 3 life, you do have 5,000 power once again, but the early game is a little bit weaker for these leaders. On the other hand, the leader effect is quite a bit stronger than Red Purple Kid. With 1 dong attached to your leader, if you have a character that costs 8 or more, then all of your characters and leader gain 1,000 power. This effect is not only on your turn, it's also on the opponent's turn. Therefore, your leader is actually a 6,000 power leader with 5 life with access to red and black Revolutionary Army cards. The Black Revolutionary Army cards in particular have a lot of very good effects that increase their cost to 8. Therefore, you can activate your leader effect much earlier than you usually would be able to, creating a scenario where your leader and your entire board is 1,000 power higher than it should be. This on paper and in practice is very powerful as it makes your leader much tankier. And the best card that's been added in OP13 to facilitate this playstyle is the Secret Rare 6-cost Subble. This Sigurd 6-cost 7,000 character is simply a blocker that on activate main gives one of your characters plus 2 cost for the turn and attaches a dong to your leader. However, with this card alone in Red Black Sabo, you can make himself 8 cost and attach a dong to your leader Sabo to therefore fulfill the condition of the leader effect immediately. This means that while you're hitting for 7,000 power on the turn that this Sabo is played, you also have an 8,000 power blocker to hide behind. The tankiness of this Sabo alongside the board spread that comes from the OP12 8-cost Dragon makes it so that this deck is very powerful and very dominant once it can get a hold of the board. With the new meta, many things have changed in terms of what cards are potentially good and bad. One of the cards that's been very strong in this current meta is single target removal. Things like Red Rock are very powerful in this meta because Ace plays 10 costs so fast in the game that if you don't have these sorts of cards, it's very difficult to deal with the aggression and power that Ace can potentially have. Ace is actually quite weak to removal, which means that black decks generally do well into Ace. However, black decks generally just can't flourish in this meta due to the fact that Ima has KO protection on all of their characters for some reason. The one single non-emo black deck in the meta that has a chance at playing in the game is Red Black Sabo, which means, importantly, that Red Black Sabo is allowed to use the 9 cost Stussy. This 9 cost Stussy, alongside the normal things that Sabo is already running in the Revolutionary package, makes it that you create a very powerful board very quickly, expand your resources, and deny the opponent the ability to build their board. As the deck has changed to be better against Ace, the Ema matchup is not as good as it once was before, but as both of these matchups are fightable, I think that Sabo is in a quite decent spot within this meta. Being able to use cards like the Stage, Revolutionary HQ, makes it that you can very easily fill up your trash with exactly the cards that you need, while also finding the pieces that you need within your hand. This consistency piece makes it so that this deck, despite the potentially lower power that may have compared to some of the top decks like Green Zoro and Ace, very consistent. Therefore, I think that although this deck may not be on par in terms of power, I think that the consistency makes up for it, making this a very, very good deck, especially if you just want to catch someone off by surprise. Next, I want to bring you to a deck that honestly could be its own video and very much maybe. Green Blue, Roronoa, and Sanji is one of the most interesting decks in the set because surprisingly, it's one of the decks that's been buffed the most. Now, Zoro Sanji has a very peculiar leader effect where when you're attacking, if you have a Dong attached to your leader, you can bounce back a character with 2 costs or higher and make one of your characters with 7,000 power or lower active. This is a very tricky leader effect to use because the conditions to meet are very difficult. Not only do you need a Dong on your leader, but you also need to have a 2 cost or higher on the board, meaning that most conventional searchers don't exactly work. Therefore, the way that most people have been building this deck recently is to build around one of the two-cost searchers that exist within the game. These two options are the 2-cost Nami, which searches East Blue type cards, and the 2-cost Kid Killer, which searches Supernovas. The East Blue Nami was the version that did very well in a tournament last season in OP12 in Japan, and revolves around the cards such as the 7-cost Hody, the 4-cost Arlong to prevent Green Zoro from attacking, and the 2-cost Vanderdecken, everyone's favorite card. The East Blue package has been getting buffs here and there over the course of the last couple of sets, being able to now use the 2-cost Koshiro as well as the 3-cost Shimotsuki Kolzaburo, which has made this searcher a much more viable option as you're not just solely looking for the 4-cost Arlong anymore. However, OP13 has brought massive buffs to the Supernova package. The 6-cost Secret Luffy has double attack and on play restands 4 of your Dong. This comes at the cost of not being able to play 5 costs after that, but for the case of Zoro Sanji, this isn't a huge demerit. As you're trying to play generally pretty low to the ground, this extra 4 long that you have to use after you've already played a very well-statted character is often used to play out another 4 cost, or even to play out some of the smaller cards such as the Kid Killer or Vivi to help set up for your leader effect. It's through these effects such as the Secret Luffy and even cards like the 4 cost Zoro and another card very similar to it in the 4 cost Uta that gives you a lot more Dong, that makes it a lot more easier for you to play your smaller characters, and of course attach Dong to your leader to make a much more aggressive and much more stable version of Zoro Sanji. This deck is very interesting in my opinion because the leader effect, while it seems very aggressive in nature, also has a lot of defensive utility that comes with that. A card like Vivi or the 2-cost Kid Killer that has already gone hand neutral, coming back to your hand now increases your hand size by 1. Therefore, if you can keep using these resources, then you'll keep increasing your hand size throughout the entire course of the game. Not only this, but because your leader effect restands the character, if, for example, you were to hit with the 7-cost Luffy and restand him afterwards, then you don't necessarily need to attack again, leaving him active as a blocker. This can also be used for other characters as well to just ensure that the opponent isn't allowed to hit into them. Zoro Sanji is a deck that I personally think has the potential to beat all 3 of the top decks in Ace, Zoro, and Ima. But the deck building aspect of this deck is extremely difficult. You can in fact very easily beat Green Zoro through the East Blue package running things like the 4-cost Arlong, and you have a very solid matchup into things like Ima with this package focusing on Supernovas. However, there's not enough space in the deck to be able to play around both of these, so therefore you have to lean towards which one of these matchups you want to tech for better. I do think that there's likely a list out there that can beat all 3 of these decks, and I haven't quite found it yet, but this is the closest that I've gotten so far. The massive resource generation from your 2 and 3 costs, as well as the cards such as Cavendish and Yamato playing a very pivotal role in this deck as attackers as well as resource generation, makes this deck extremely resilient to be able to actually contend with the resource generation that OP13 leaders have. This, alongside some surprise plays like being able to play the forecast putting off of the forecast it does on KO effect, makes it that many people just have no idea what they're doing when they're fighting this deck, making this an extremely explosive offensive defensive deck that's only limited by your imagination. One card that I think that many people will be very curious about is the 2-cost Sugar. While the top part of the effect needs you to be a Don Quixote pirate type leader, the on-play effect that simply rests a 4-cost or less is not leader locked. Therefore, against things like 4-cost Marco, against things like 4-cost Warcury, and of course the 4-cost Zoro that comes out of Zoro, this card is exceptionally powerful, making it very good in this specific meta. While Zoro Sanji is very underexplored and therefore unrefined, I still think that the deck has a very strong standing within this meta, and in the next couple of weeks can potentially start to shake up the top. The final deck that we're going to talk about in this video is going to be the man who never dies, Blue Purple Luffy. Blue Purple Luffy is a deck that by all accounts seemed like it was meant to die. Bandai killed 2 of its strongest cards, but decided not to ban the leader, allowing for rooms sometime down the line for the deck to maybe be viable once again. However, that time seems to have come much too soon, as not only is it doing well in OP12, I believe that it has a lot of potential in OP13. While it's still not as refined in OP13 in the East as it is compared to the OP12 in the West, this deck has seen gradual increase in play rate as well as win rate. It turns out that the 9-cost Sanji as well as the leader effect of being able to draw 2 cards per turn essentially is a little bit too strong. Blue Purple Luffy in OP13 has shockingly also received some buffs in the 8-cost Rayleigh. This 8-cost Rayleigh is innately a rush card, and if you have a given dong to either a character or your leader, then you can rest on the opponent's 5-cost or less characters, and at the end of your turn, gain 1 dong active. This card is perfect when you're going first, as when you ramp to 9 dong, you're going to end the turn with 10, meaning that you can use Gum Giant immediately after. Another card that I'm personally running in my Blue Purple Luffy deck is the 6-cost Hancock. Now, I've always really liked this card in Blue Purple Luffy, but I've never been able to justify running it in the deck, as in the mirror, the 9-cost Luffy was the strongest card and was the target that you would want to lock. However, because Hancock cannot lock cards called Luffy, this was not a viable option in Blue Purple Luffy where there are lots of mirrors going on. However, now in this meta with the largest targets being the 10-cost Newgate, this card becomes much more viable again. Being able to prevent a character from attacking for an entire turn with the 6-cost Hancock is effectively like a blocker. However, compared to the 8-cost Katakuri that can only block up to 8,000 for free, this Hancock can effectively counter infinitely for the entire turn. Therefore, in this meta with very large bodies, I think that this card is very powerful. This, as well as some new consistency pieces like the 1-cost Otama, make this deck a lot more stronger than people expected. Not only this, but as we mentioned in the Roger section, the 8-cost Roger can work very well with Luffy, as it makes your leader 8,000 power while also potentially setting up 2 characters on the board that are 9,000 and 10,000 power if you manage to play it off of the 9-cost Sanji. This is a massive card for the Green Zoro matchup that can potentially shape how the meta is going to be, as that seems to be the final hurdle for Blue Purple Luffy currently, as he has a solid matchup into Ace and a reasonable matchup into Ima. Blue Purple Luffy as a deck is still rather underexplored, and I would like to look at some of the Western techs, such as the 5-cost Soshnanda, to potentially make this deck stronger. Still, I think that this perhaps is going to end up becoming one of the top decks by the end of the meta once people actually refine it, because there is actually a force of people trying to figure out this deck. Unlike Zoro Sanji, where there is probably a good deck list out there that people aren't exactly looking for, Blue Purple Luffy seems to be the obvious answer for something that could potentially break into the meta, and will likely see very quick refinement of the list in time to come. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It was a different take on my usual format, where instead of looking at other people's results and showing you their lists, this was all my pure testing and my opinions on the meta. If you guys enjoyed this, there's a longer version on my Metafy. There's also a lot of other articles by some very famous Japanese players as well, if you want to check that out as well. Thank you very much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and I'll make sure to put out more of these. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.